The mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappearance. Imagine boarding a plane for what should be a routine overnight flight. You settle into your seat, maybe you read a book, watch a movie, or try to sleep. Everything seems perfectly normal. The engines hum steadily. The cabin crew moves quietly through the aisles. Outside your window, darkness stretches endlessly over the ocean. You have no idea that in a few hours, you and everyone else on this aircraft will simply vanish from the face of the earth, becoming part of the greatest aviation mystery in modern history. This is exactly what happened to the 239 souls aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and nearly a decade later, we still don't know why. March 8, 2014 started as an unremarkable day at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Flight 370, a Boeing 777-200ER, sat at the gate being prepared for its scheduled journey to Beijing. This aircraft was one of the safest models ever built, with an impeccable safety record. The Boeing 777 had been flying for nearly 2 decades without a single fatal crash. The plane scheduled for this flight was built in 2002 and had logged nearly 34,000 hours of flight time without any significant issues. Everything about this aircraft said reliability. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah arrived at the airport that evening as he had done countless times before. At 53 years old, he was one of Malaysia Airlines' most experienced pilots with more than 18,000 hours of flight time. He was known as a meticulous professional, someone who took his job seriously. His colleagues described him as a friendly, approachable man who was passionate about aviation. He had even built an elaborate flight simulator in his home, where he would practice different scenarios in his spare time. Flying wasn't just his job, it was his life. Joining him in the cockpit would be First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, a younger pilot with nearly 3,000 hours of experience. At 27, Farik was well-trained and capable, though this was actually his first flight aboard a 777 as a fully qualified first officer without a training captain supervising him. The passenger manifest that night was diverse and international. The majority, 153 people, were Chinese nationals, many of them heading home to Beijing after business trips or vacations in Malaysia. There were Malaysians, Indonesians, Australians, Americans, and passengers from various other countries. Among them were 2 men traveling on stolen passports, a detail that would later spark intense speculation about terrorism. There were families traveling together, artists heading to an exhibition, employees of a Texas-based technology company, and individuals simply going about their lives. Each had their own story, their own reasons for being on that plane, their own people waiting for them to arrive safely in Beijing. The aircraft pushed back from Gate C1 at 12:41 a.m. local time, just about on schedule. Everything proceeded normally. The pilots went through their standard checklists, communicating with ground control as they taxied toward the runway. At 12:42 a.m., the flight was cleared to taxi to runway 32 right. Weather conditions were good, clear skies with excellent visibility. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual was about to happen. At 12:42 a.m., First Officer Farik made routine communication with air traffic control, and the tower cleared Flight 370 for takeoff. The Boeing 777's twin engines roared to life, pushing the aircraft down the runway until it lifted smoothly into the night sky at 12:42 a.m. The plane climbed steadily, turning northeast toward Beijing. Captain Zahari made the last normal voice transmission at 1:01 a.m., acknowledging a handoff from Malaysian air traffic control to Vietnamese airspace with the words, "Good night, Malaysian 370." His voice was calm, professional, unremarkable. Those would be the last words anyone would definitively hear from Flight 370. At 1:07 a.m., something changed. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS, which automatically transmits data about the plane's performance and position, failed to send its next scheduled message. This system typically transmits every 30 minutes, and the next message was expected at 1:37 a.m. That message never came. At 1:19 a.m., the plane's transponder, which broadcasts the aircraft's identity, altitude, and speed to air traffic control, stopped transmitting. In the world of aviation, this is not normal. A transponder doesn't just turn off by accident. Someone has to deliberately switch it off, or something catastrophic has to happen to the aircraft's electrical systems. Air traffic controllers in Vietnam expected Flight 370 to make contact as it entered their airspace. That contact never came. At first, there was confusion rather than alarm. Perhaps there was a communication problem. Maybe the pilots were having radio issues. Controllers tried to make contact. Silence. They reached out to their Malaysian counterparts. Had the plane turned back? Did they still have it on radar? The Malaysians checked their screens. The transponder signal was gone. They tried to reach the aircraft. Nothing. Slowly, the realization began to dawn that something was very wrong. What nobody knew at that moment was that Flight 370 hadn't crashed. It had turned. Military radar, which unlike civilian radar can track aircraft even without transponder signals, had captured something extraordinary. The aircraft had made a sharp turn to the left, deviating dramatically from its planned route to Beijing. Instead of continuing northeast over the South China Sea toward China, the plane had turned back across the Malay Peninsula. It had flown over Malaysia itself, crossing from the east coast to the west coast. This wasn't a gradual drift or a minor course correction. This was a deliberate, controlled turn executed by someone who knew how to fly the aircraft. The plane flew across the Malaysian peninsula, passing over the state of Penang. Then it turned northwest, flying up the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Military radar tracked the aircraft until 2:22 a.m., at which point it disappeared from their screens as well, somewhere over the Andaman Sea. The aircraft had flown for over an hour since its last normal communication, heading in completely the wrong direction, with no communication, no distress signal, no indication of what was happening on board. But the plane still wasn't finished. While military radar had lost track of Flight 370, something else was still listening. A British satellite company called Inmarsat operated a network of satellites that provided communication services to aircraft. Flight 370's satellite communication system performed a series of automated hourly handshakes with an Inmarsat satellite positioned over the Indian Ocean. These handshakes didn't contain information about the plane's exact location, but they did confirm that the aircraft was still powered and still airborne. The last of these electronic handshakes occurred at 8:19 a.m., more than 7 hours after takeoff, meaning Flight 370 had continued flying for hours after it disappeared from radar. When the sun rose on March 8, Flight 370 should have been landing in Beijing. Instead, family members gathered at the airport waiting for their loved ones began to realize something was terribly wrong. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia Airlines officials faced a nightmare scenario. One of their aircraft was missing. Not crashed with a known location, but simply gone, somewhere over Southeast Asia or the Indian Ocean. How do you tell families that you've lost contact with an entire airplane and have no idea where it is or what happened? The initial search focused on the South China Sea along the plane's intended route to Beijing. This made sense given that this was where the aircraft had disappeared from civilian radar. Ships and aircraft from multiple countries rushed to the area, scanning the water for any sign of debris. Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the United States all contributed resources. Search planes flew grid patterns over the blue waters. Ships plowed through the waves, crews scanning the surface for floating wreckage. But they were looking in the wrong place. As military radar data was reviewed and shared, the staggering truth emerged. The plane had turned back. It had flown across Malaysia. The search area, already enormous, now had to expand dramatically. Attention shifted to the Strait of Malacca and then to the Andaman Sea. International cooperation began to strain under the weight of the mystery. Why had Malaysia taken so long to reveal the military radar data? What else weren't they sharing? Conspiracy theories began to flourish in the information vacuum. Then came the Inmarsat analysis. Engineers at the satellite company had been poring over the electronic handshakes between their satellite and the aircraft. While these signals didn't contain GPS data, the engineers realized they could extract other information. They could analyze the timing of the signals and the Doppler shift in the signal frequency. This is the same effect that makes an ambulance siren sound higher pitched as it approaches you and lower pitched as it moves away. By analyzing these subtle variations, Inmarsat's team worked out that the aircraft must have flown along one of two possible arcs, one stretching northwest over Asia, the other extending southwest over the remote southern Indian Ocean. The northern arc was quickly ruled out. Such a route would have taken the plane over multiple countries with sophisticated radar systems including India, Pakistan, and China. Despite extensive checking, no military radar in the region had detected an unidentified aircraft matching Flight 370's description. This left the southern arc, a route that would have taken the plane over the vast, empty stretches of the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote and inhospitable regions on Earth. If Flight 370 had flown south, it had flown to one of the loneliest parts of the planet. On March 24, based on the satellite analysis, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak made a devastating announcement. Flight 370, he said, had ended in the southern Indian Ocean. There were no survivors. Families who had been holding on to hope were now confronted with almost certain loss. But without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical proof, many refused to accept this conclusion. How could anyone be certain? The ocean is vast, but planes don't just disappear, do they? The search operation that followed became the most expensive in aviation history. An Australian agency, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, took the lead in coordinating what would become an underwater search of unprecedented scale. The area to be searched covered thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The southern Indian Ocean is notoriously stormy. The water in the search area was 4 kilometers deep in places. The seafloor was mountainous and largely unmapped. Specialized ships equipped with sophisticated sonar systems were deployed to scan the ocean floor. Autonomous underwater vehicles dove into the depths, their sensors probing the darkness for any sign of the missing aircraft. The search vessels battled enormous swells, howling winds, and the sheer logistical challenge of working thousands of kilometers from the nearest port. Month after month, they searched. They found ancient shipwrecks, previously unknown underwater volcanoes, and diverse marine life. But they didn't find Flight 370. Then, in July 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, something washed ashore on Réunion Island in the western Indian Ocean. A man walking along the beach found a large piece of debris, a wing component called a flaperon. Aviation experts examined photographs and quickly became excited. This flaperon came from a Boeing 777. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was the only Boeing 777 missing anywhere in the world. The debris was transported to France, where investigators confirmed what many suspected. The flaperon came from Flight 370. For the first time since the plane disappeared, there was physical proof of what had happened. The aircraft had indeed crashed into the ocean. But this discovery, while confirming the crash, only deepened the mystery of why. More debris began washing up over the following months and years. Pieces of the aircraft were found on beaches in Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Tanzania. Each piece was carried westward by the ocean's currents from where the plane had crashed somewhere in the eastern Indian Ocean. Investigators examined each fragment carefully. The pattern of damage, the way the metal had torn, the marine life that had attached itself to the debris, all of this provided clues. But none of it answered the fundamental question: why did this plane fly for hours in the wrong direction before crashing into the ocean? The physical evidence was puzzling in what it revealed and what it didn't. Some of the debris showed evidence that the aircraft had broken apart when it hit the water, but the damage patterns didn't suggest a high-speed, nose-down crash. If the plane had simply run out of fuel and fallen from the sky, investigators would expect to see different damage. Some experts suggested the evidence was more consistent with a controlled ditching, meaning someone might have been flying the plane when it came down. But if someone was in control, why fly to one of the most remote locations on Earth? Why not send a distress signal? Why cut off all communication? The official search of the seafloor continued until January 2017, having covered 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. When it was suspended, they had found nothing. No wreckage field, no debris, no black boxes. It seemed impossible. With the satellite data, with drift modeling of the found debris, search coordinators were confident they were looking in the right area. Yet the main wreckage eluded them. A private company, Ocean Infinity, later conducted another search using more advanced technology, covering an additional 112,000 square kilometers in early 2018. They too found nothing. So what happened to Flight 370? In the absence of definitive answers, theories have proliferated, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Let's examine what we actually know and what the various theories propose. The pilot suicide theory has been one of the most controversial explanations. This theory suggests that Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah deliberately crashed the aircraft. Proponents point to several factors. The plane's movements, the deliberate turning off of communication systems, the controlled flight path, all of this required someone with knowledge of the aircraft systems. The timing of when various systems were disabled suggested someone in the cockpit was responsible. Investigators looked into Zahari's background extensively. They examined his home flight simulator and found he had run a simulation of a flight into the southern Indian Ocean, though this was one of many simulations he had conducted over the years, and there's debate about when exactly it was done and its significance. Those who knew Zahari personally largely reject this theory. They describe a man who loved his family, was passionate about his work, and showed no obvious signs of depression or suicidal ideation. His marriage was stable, his career was successful, and friends saw no warning signs. Suicide by aircraft is, fortunately, very rare, but it has happened before. Investigators looked at cases like Egypt Air Flight 990, where evidence strongly suggested deliberate action by a pilot. But in that case, there was more direct evidence. The lack of any clear motive or warning signs makes many uncomfortable with this explanation for Flight 370, even as the aircraft's behavior seems to indicate deliberate human action. Others have suggested the first officer might have been responsible, or that there was a struggle in the cockpit. Perhaps a hijacker gained access to the flight deck. This brings us to another theory: terrorism or hijacking. When it was discovered that 2 Iranian men had boarded the plane using stolen passports, alarms went off. Could this have been a terrorist attack? Investigators quickly identified the men as asylum seekers trying to reach Europe and cleared them of any involvement in the plane's disappearance. Still, could someone else have hijacked the aircraft? If so, what was their goal? Traditional hijackings involve demands or result in the plane being flown somewhere and landed. Flight 370's final flight path suggests an intention to disappear, which doesn't fit typical hijacking patterns. Some have theorized about cyber hijacking, the idea that someone could have remotely taken control of the aircraft through its electronic systems. Aviation experts largely dismiss this scenario. While modern aircraft do have sophisticated computer systems, the ability to override manual controls from outside the aircraft simply doesn't exist in commercial aviation, precisely because it would represent an enormous security vulnerability. The Boeing 777, while technologically advanced, still requires humans physically in the cockpit to fly it. Then there's the catastrophic failure scenario. Could something have gone wrong with the aircraft itself? A fire, an explosion, rapid decompression? Such events have brought down aircraft before. The sudden loss of communication could be explained by a catastrophic event that damaged the plane's systems. However, this theory struggles to explain the plane's subsequent flight path. A crippled aircraft experiencing a catastrophic emergency doesn't typically make precise navigational turns. The path Flight 370 flew after its communication system stopped was too controlled, too deliberate. It followed navigational waypoints, suggesting someone was flying the plane with purpose. A variation of this theory involves a fire or other emergency that incapacitated the pilots while leaving the aircraft flyable. Perhaps they were trying to turn back to land at an airport when they were overcome. The plane, on autopilot, could have continued flying until it ran out of fuel. This would explain the lack of communication if the pilots were incapacitated and the deliberate turn if they initiated it before becoming unable to continue. But it doesn't fully explain the specific flight path or why the plane ended up so far south. The depressurization theory has also been extensively discussed. If the aircraft lost cabin pressure, everyone on board could have been incapacitated by hypoxia within minutes. Passengers and crew would have lost consciousness. If the oxygen masks failed or the decompression was so rapid that people couldn't react in time, the plane could have flown on as a ghost ship with everyone unconscious or dead, eventually crashing when it ran out of fuel. This has happened before. Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed in 2005 after flying for hours with everyone on board unconscious due to hypoxia. But again, this doesn't easily explain the deliberate course changes Flight 370 made, unless those changes were initiated before the pilots were incapacitated. The lack of debris initially found sparked wilder theories. Some claimed the plane had been shot down by a military, with the responsible nation then covering it up. But shooting down an aircraft full of civilians would be an international incident of enormous proportions, and keeping such a secret would require conspiracy on an impossible scale. Others suggested the plane landed somewhere and was hidden, that passengers and crew were alive. But where? And why? As debris from the aircraft began washing up on shores, these theories became untenable. The plane had crashed into the ocean. The physics of the debris drift patterns confirmed it. There are theories involving hijacking with the intent of using the plane as a weapon, similar to the September 11th attacks, but somehow the plan went wrong. There are theories about cargo, suggestions that something dangerous was being transported that either caused the crash or made the plane a target. Investigators examined the cargo manifest and found nothing unusual or hazardous. There are even theories involving military intervention, suggestions that the plane was somehow involved in espionage or military operations. Each theory, when examined carefully, has significant evidentiary problems. What makes this mystery so frustrating is that we have just enough information to rule out many possibilities but not enough to confirm what actually happened. We know the plane turned back across Malaysia. We know communication systems were deliberately disabled. We know the aircraft flew for hours. We know it crashed into the southern Indian Ocean. We have debris proving the crash. What we don't know is why. The black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder would answer so many questions. These devices are designed to survive crashes and emit a locating beacon for 30 days. But they were never found. The search began too late and in the wrong area, meaning by the time searchers were looking in the southern Indian Ocean, the beacons had long since stopped transmitting. The ocean is vast and deep, and without knowing the precise crash location, finding the black boxes became like searching for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. The human element of this tragedy cannot be forgotten amid the technical mystery. 239 people were on that plane. Each was an individual with dreams, families, and futures. The Chinese families, making up the majority of the passenger manifest, have been particularly vocal in demanding answers. Many have refused to accept the official conclusion that their loved ones are dead. How can they be expected to find closure without remains to bury, without clear answers about what happened? The families have organized, protested, and demanded accountability. They've accused Malaysian authorities of incompetence and cover-ups. Some of these criticisms are justified. The Malaysian government's handling of the crisis, especially in the early days, was confused and contradictory. Information was released slowly and sometimes incorrectly. But is this evidence of conspiracy or merely the fog of an unprecedented crisis? Probably the latter, though it doesn't make the pain any less for those left behind. Consider the technology company employees aboard, 12 Malaysians and 1 Chinese national who worked for Freescale Semiconductor. They were traveling home from business. Some conspiracy theories latched onto their presence, noting that the company worked on electronic warfare and semiconductor technology. But there's no evidence their presence on the flight was anything other than routine business travel. Think about the passengers who were on vacation. One couple was celebrating a delayed honeymoon. Others were returning from visiting family. Think about the crew members, the flight attendants who were just doing their jobs, who had no control over what was happening. The aircraft carried infants, children, teenagers, adults, and elderly passengers. Whatever happened in those final hours happened to all of them. The captain's family has lived under a cloud of suspicion. Zahari's wife, children, and extended family have had to endure speculation and accusations without ever getting clear answers themselves. If he was responsible, they're victims of his actions. If he wasn't, they're victims of unfair suspicion while also grieving his loss. The first officer's family faces similar pain. Neither family has closure. From a technical standpoint, the disappearance of Flight 370 has led to changes in aviation. The fact that a modern aircraft could disappear highlighted vulnerabilities in how we track planes. In our world of constant connectivity, where your smartphone can be located anywhere on Earth, a massive aircraft with hundreds of people aboard was able to vanish. This seemed absurd, and it was. The aviation industry has responded. New regulations now require more frequent position reporting for aircraft flying over remote areas. The tracking of commercial flights has improved. Newer aircraft are being equipped with systems that make it much harder for their location systems to be manually disabled. Battery life for the beacons on flight recorders has been extended. Some airlines now use deployable recorders that separate from the aircraft during a crash and float on the water's surface. But these changes, while positive, came too late for Flight 370. The investigation was hampered at every turn by the limitations of the technology and procedures in place in 2014. If the same event occurred today, the response would be quicker and more informed, but that's little comfort to those who lost loved ones. The geopolitical aspects of the disappearance added layers of complexity. The plane disappeared in a region where multiple countries have overlapping territorial claims and sensitivities. Getting different military and civilian authorities to share information, especially radar data that might reveal capabilities they prefer to keep secret, was challenging. The search itself required cooperation between Malaysia, China, Australia, and other nations, each with their own interests and bureaucracies. Some of the early confusion and contradictory information released can be traced to these geopolitical sensitivities. Countries were hesitant to reveal what their military radar could and couldn't see. This delayed the understanding of where the plane had actually flown and wasted precious time in the early search efforts. What haunts investigators most is probably how close they might have come to finding the wreckage without knowing it. The underwater search covered vast areas of the seafloor, but the ocean is so enormous and so deep that they could have passed within a small distance of the wreckage and missed it. The sonar systems, while sophisticated, have limitations. Difficult terrain could hide wreckage. The debris field might be smaller or more scattered than expected. Or, and this possibility troubles search coordinators most, the calculations about where the plane crashed might have been wrong. The Inmarsat analysis was groundbreaking, using data in ways it was never intended to be used, but it involved assumptions and calculations that, if even slightly off, could mean the wreckage lies outside the searched areas. Some independent researchers have proposed alternative crash locations based on different interpretations of the data or additional factors like oceanographic conditions. Each new proposal generates hope among families that perhaps, finally, someone has figured it out. But without the resources to search each proposed location, and with governments having largely moved on from active searching, these theories remain unproven. The debris that washed ashore has been both a blessing and a curse for the investigation. It confirmed the crash, which is important. Analysis of the debris provided some information about how the aircraft broke apart. The marine life attached to the pieces gave clues about oceanographic conditions. The debris was found on African shores, consistent with models of how wreckage in the eastern Indian Ocean would drift westward over months and years. All of this supported the theory that the plane crashed in the southern Indian Ocean. But the debris didn't pinpoint where. The ocean currents could have carried pieces hundreds or thousands of kilometers from the crash site. And frustratingly, while dozens of pieces of debris have been found or reported, large sections of the aircraft that might provide more definitive answers remain lost. Psychologically, this mystery represents something that deeply unsettles us. We like to believe we have mastered our technology, that we have systems and redundancies that prevent such things. A plane disappearing feels like something from a different era, not from our modern world of satellites and global connectivity. It reminds us that for all our technological advancement, nature is vast and there are still ways to be lost that we cannot prevent. For aviation professionals, Flight 370 is a reminder of how much we still don't know. Despite decades of investigation into aircraft accidents, despite all the safety improvements, despite incredible technology, a sequence of events occurred that we still cannot fully explain. Every accident investigation in aviation history has led to learning, to improvements that make flying safer. But how can you learn from an accident when you don't know exactly what happened? The industry has implemented changes, yes, but there's an unsettling feeling that without understanding the cause, we might not have addressed the actual vulnerability. The religious and cultural dimensions of this tragedy also deserve recognition. For families from various faiths and backgrounds, the inability to recover remains has spiritual implications. Many religious traditions have specific practices around death and burial. Without remains, these practices cannot be completed, adding spiritual anguish to emotional grief. Some families have held memorial services, but how do you memorialize someone when there's no body, when a part of you still hopes they might somehow have survived? The conspiracy theories, while often frustrating to those seeking factual answers, represent a very human response to unexplained tragedy. When something terrible happens without a clear explanation, people seek patterns and meaning. They struggle to accept that sometimes, we simply don't know. A conspiracy, while disturbing, at least provides an explanation, a narrative that makes sense of the senseless. The truth that we may never know what happened to Flight 370 is, for many, harder to accept than even the darkest conspiracy theory. Media coverage of the disappearance was intense, especially in the first weeks. Every development, real or speculated, was broadcast globally. This created pressure on investigators and authorities to provide updates even when there was little new information. It also spread misinformation. Reports that were later corrected had already circulated widely. This damaged public trust and fed conspiracy theories. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, managing an investigation while also managing public information flow proved enormously challenging. Expert analysts filled hours of airtime speculating about what might have happened. Some of this analysis was informed and helpful. Some was pure speculation presented as possibility. For families watching desperately for any news, it was often impossible to distinguish between evidence-based analysis and conjecture. This media environment, while reflecting public interest in the story, sometimes hindered more than helped. Let's return to what the evidence most strongly suggests. Someone in the cockpit almost certainly took deliberate action to divert the plane and disable communication systems. This is the conclusion that best fits the evidence of the plane's movements and the timing of when systems went offline. Whether this was one of the pilots, both pilots, someone else who gained access to the cockpit, or what their motivation might have been, we cannot say with certainty. But the aircraft's behavior indicates intent. The plane then flew for hours, eventually crashing into the southern Indian Ocean. Whether it was being actively piloted until the end or was flying on autopilot with everyone aboard dead or incapacitated is unclear. The debris evidence has been interpreted both ways by different experts. The plane is somewhere on the ocean floor in a region that has been partially searched but where vast areas remain unexplored. What would it take to definitively solve this mystery? Finding the main wreckage and recovering the black boxes. The flight data recorder would show exactly what the plane did, every control input, every system status change. The cockpit voice recorder would reveal what was said in the cockpit in the final hours, what sounds were present. These devices are built to survive extreme crashes and provide exactly the information needed to reconstruct what happened. They're out there, somewhere in the darkness of the deep ocean, holding the answers to questions that have haunted us for years. The cost of continuing the search is substantial. The areas that would need to be searched cover thousands of square kilometers in extremely challenging conditions. Is it worth the expense and effort? For the families of those who died, absolutely. They deserve answers. They deserve closure. From a pure aviation safety perspective, the calculation is more complex. The changes already implemented may have addressed the vulnerabilities, even without knowing the exact cause. But there's something deeply unsatisfying about giving up, about accepting that this mystery might remain unsolved. Private efforts have continued. Some individuals have become obsessed with solving the mystery, poring over data, running calculations, proposing new search areas. Debris hunters walk beaches in the western Indian Ocean, looking for pieces of the plane. Each piece found is catalogued and analyzed, but the finds have become less frequent as the years pass and currents disperse the debris more widely. Technology continues to advance. The seafloor mapping technology available today is better than what was used in the initial searches. Autonomous underwater vehicles can search longer and more efficiently. Perhaps at some point, with better technology and renewed resources, the search will resume and finally succeed. Or perhaps the wreckage will be stumbled upon by chance, discovered during some other ocean survey or expedition decades from now. The story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is ultimately a story about the limits of knowledge. We live in an age where we expect answers. We have become accustomed to information being readily available, to technology providing solutions. This disappearance defies those expectations. It's a reminder that the world still contains mysteries, that for all our advancement, we can still be faced with questions we cannot answer. For those 239 people who boarded the plane that night, it was supposed to be a routine flight. Some probably slept through whatever happened in the early hours. Others might have been awake, watching movies, reading, perhaps looking out the window at the stars over the ocean. At some point, something went wrong. Maybe it happened quickly. Maybe there was fear and confusion. Or maybe, hopefully, they never knew. Maybe whatever happened rendered everyone unconscious quickly, and they simply never woke up. We tell ourselves this because the alternative, that people were aware and afraid for hours, is too terrible to contemplate. The final moments of Flight 370 remain unknown. Did the plane glide down in a controlled descent, or did it fall from the sky when the fuel ran out? Did it break apart in the air or on impact with the water? Was anyone conscious? These questions may never be answered unless the wreckage is found. What we can say is that somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, in waters several kilometers deep, rests the wreckage of a Boeing 777. Within that wreckage are the physical remains of people who deserve to arrive safely in Beijing but never did. Their families deserve answers. The world deserves to understand what happened so we can ensure it never happens again. The mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 stands as one of the most baffling puzzles of our time. It has spawned countless investigations, theories, and debates. It has changed how we track aircraft and think about aviation safety. It has caused immeasurable grief to hundreds of families. And nearly a decade later, despite all our technology, despite massive search efforts, despite the collective will to understand, the core question remains unanswered. Why did Flight 370 turn away from its destination and fly into the remote ocean? What happened in that cockpit? What were the final hours like for those aboard? These questions haunt us because they remain, frustratingly, just beyond our ability to answer. The truth is out there, somewhere in the deep, waiting to be found. Until that day comes, if it ever does, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 will remain one of aviation's greatest mysteries, a reminder that in an age of information and technology, it's still possible for 239 people to simply vanish, leaving behind only questions, grief, and scattered pieces of wreckage on distant shores. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Somewhere in its depths lies an airplane, a tomb, and the answers we seek. The families wait. The world wonders. And the mystery endures.